Africa's aviation sector is at a crossroads. Data shows that the continent is becoming one of the fastest growing air travel markets in the world, yet continues to generate the lowest returns per passenger globally. Initiatives such as the Single African Air Transport Market promise open skies, while the African Continental Free Trade Area pushes for deeper connectivity. However, they are little more than aspirations at this point. So this week on the program, we examine what's holding back Africa's aviation industry and how to unlock its true potential. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, a significant number of African countries continue to struggle with the absence of a functional national carrier. As of June 2025, around 16 African countries did not have a national airline. Some collapsed under crushing debt, while others were lost to political and financial mismanagement. Several African national carriers, including Uganda Airlines and Kenya Airways, are facing financial and management crisis. Africa remains the weakest region globally in airline financial performance and is expected to return a combined airline profit of only $200 million in 2026, barely 0.5% of global airline profits. Flying within Africa is on average 45% more expensive than similar flights in other regions of the world. The African Development Bank's Visa Openness Index has found that for 46% of intra-Africa travel, Africans still need a visa before traveling. Only 4 African countries, Rwanda, Benin, the Gambia and Seychelles, do not require visas for travelers from other African countries. Well, joining me now to unpack Africa's turbulent skies are from Mumbai, Sean Mendes, aviation consultant, and from Johannesburg in South Africa, Aaron Munetsi, CEO, Airlines Association of Southern Africa. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Sean, let me start off with you here and start off by getting some forecasts for 2026. The International Air Transport Association forecasts global air travel growth of 4.9% in 2026. However, Africa is projected to exceed that global average with a 6% growth in 2026. Let's take a step back and look at the sector today. Is Africa's aviation sector actually taking off, or is it still struggling to get off the runway?
Thanks very much for having us. I think that's a very good question. But when we start looking at these percentage basis growth, I don't think there's any question that Africa's aviation has huge potential. And so even when we start looking at 6 or 10%, this potential, this growth is starting from such a low base that the absolute numbers pale in comparison with the rest of the world. Africa represents approximately 15 to 17% of global population, but only 3% of global air traffic to begin with. However, the saving grace for Africa is, and this is something we've seen in developing countries all over the world, is that when a country enters a lower middle income, which approximately 40 to 50 African countries are currently in, the demand for air travel grows at approximately double the rate of per capita GDP. And therefore, we see that potentially Africa, by virtue of just the growth that is happening organically in Africa, in addition to some of the stimulation and other improvements in infrastructure within African aviation, can indeed exceed global averages by a significant amount, not just necessarily this 1 to 2% that IATA is forecasting, but if done well, it can even double that.
Right, Aaron, let's look at those numbers. Africa's numbers paling in comparison to the global average because we're starting from such a low situation. About 18% of the world's population, Aaron, lives in Africa, yet it is accounting for less than 2% of global air travel. Why is this? What specific weaknesses hold African airlines back from global competitiveness?
You're absolutely correct. I mean, with 1.4 billion people on the African continent, we are definitely hitting around 18 to 20% of the global population. Our biggest challenge is when you compare that with other continents and even other countries that are far lower than us in terms of the number of people, and yet their contribution to global aviation is much higher than ours. Ours is at 2%. So you find that, like my colleague Sean said earlier on, When there is that growth in GDP, you find that the number of passengers or people traveling by air automatically increases. So this is the first port of call, and I would say the first challenge that we face on the African continent. In as much as we have the numbers, our economies are not performing that well. And I can tell you, since 2020, we've been hearing quite a number of encouraging numbers as far as growth indicators are concerned. The lowest will be about 1.2%, and the highest up to 10% of growth of GDP. But if you compare that with other countries, when the GDP is between 4 and 5%, the number of passengers automatically increases. That's the first thing. The second thing is you find that the cost of travel on the African continent is substantially higher than anywhere else in the world. As a matter of fact, the International Air Transport Association's last report showed that the cost of taxes, fees, and charges on the African continent is approximately 39% higher than anywhere else. And third, the fact that our infrastructure is not coping with the demand means that we are not going to achieve the numbers that we want to achieve. Those three factors are actually fundamentally what is holding us back.
Right, Sean, interesting point here, cost of travel being substantially higher than other parts of the world. And I did find some statistics recently which showed that, a flight from Nairobi, for instance, to London, or a flight from Nairobi to Egypt cost about the same. Why is the cost of travel so exorbitant on the continent?
I've run airlines in Africa, and I think what I call it is a 30% Africa premium. Sometimes doing exactly the same thing in Africa just costs you 30% more than if you did it in a more developed economy. Say, for example, you're running an airline and you need a spare part for your aircraft. If you're operating this airline in, say, Miami or Amsterdam or Dubai, you basically send your guy down the street to one of 10 different vendors. He buys it and he brings it back. And 1 hour later, that part's installed in your aircraft and it's ready to go. However, if you're running that same airline in Africa and you have this problem, you have two choices. Number one is you spend millions of dollars to hold stock of that part in your own stores here, and that is capital that that comes at its own cost. Or number two, you order it from the vendor in Miami or Amsterdam or Dubai, and then you pay DHL or FedEx to send it to you, and then it has to go through customs clearance and so forth. So when you start looking at things like that, you look in terms of fuel, where fuel has to come from refineries that are thousands of kilometers away, while in many other countries these are just simply delivered by pipeline. You look in terms of the cost of training, where in many countries you can simply have local simulator training organizations who can train your people, while from Africa you invariably have to send people, if not outside of the continent, but just a few centers like Johannesburg or Addis Ababa where these simulators are installed. So these costs come into, before we even start looking in terms of taxes and airport fees and things, which are also a lot higher in Africa. We just look at these hidden costs which add 30% to the bottom line of simply operating an airline in Africa, with all else being equal relative to a developed economy.
Right. So, Aaron, we've established that the cost of travel is substantially higher than the global average. We've also established that there is actually demand on the continent for air travel. But I do want to stick with some statistics from IATA for a moment, because of the $41 billion in global net profit forecast for 2026, African carriers are expected to generate just about $200 million, dollars in profit. This is the lowest of all regions. Aaron, why do African airlines struggle financially despite what you've talked about, that strong demand for connectivity?
That's also a very interesting analysis, because when you think about it, these global airlines, I can assure you, when you go deeper, you'll find that quite a number of them make quite a lot of money and profit from the African continent. And like my colleague Sean pointed out earlier on, the premium for operating an airline in those environments is substantially lower than in Africa. So even if you take the same customer paying exactly the same fee to a non-African airline, that non-African airline automatically starts making more money than their African airline counterpart. And that comes to maybe two basic things. The first one, and I want to add on to what Sean said earlier on, when it comes to aircraft acquisition, you could be leasing the aircraft or buying the aircraft. The trend that we have seen is that a majority of airlines globally are actually leasing more than they are buying. But when we do a check of the African airlines, you'll find that the majority of our airlines actually own the aircraft. There is an inherent cost in owning an aircraft because the moment you buy the aircraft, the technology that you're using becomes obsolete or obsolete. So when you have obsolete technology, you need to replace it on an ongoing basis. That's the first thing. The second thing is when we did an analysis of the age of the fleet of the aircraft that we operate on the continent versus other regions and other continents, ours is substantially older than everybody else. So the older the aircraft, the more maintenance requirements you have. And unfortunately for us, we don't even have the capacity to be able to do the maintenance ourselves. So we take the aircraft back to where we originally acquired them from, and that costs us money for the aircraft to go there, get serviced, and then come back. That all adds up to the cost of operating the aircraft.
Where is the challenge here? Is this a failure of management, or is it that the African operating environment is simply too expensive now, to allow for sustainable margins?
It's actually both. So we find ourselves entangled with a lot of rules and regulations, policies and procedures that are outdated. And for us to go through the hoops to be able to continuously be able to conform with those regulations that are outdated, we are held back. Whereas our competitors, our counterparts that are coming from outside the African continent, find that it's easier for them to operate in their own environments. A simple thing like, for example, if we talk about standardization of training, I'll give you an example. If a pilot is trained in any one of the African countries, for them to go across the road to the next country, they need to go through recertification, and it takes a lot of time and money. Compare that to Europe, for example. With 27 countries in Europe, you get a pilot's license in any one of those countries. You are free to go and operate in any one of the other 26 countries without any restriction, without any recertification. That's just one element. Now, when it comes to the other element, which is the actual regulation of the African environment, the demand is there. The regulation is what is holding back the demand. How is it holding back? It's because we now have what we call protectionism. Countries that don't have their own national carriers, for example, still want to hold on to this dream of having a national carrier, and in so doing, they try as much as possible to protect that ailing national carrier. Some of the times, the ailing carrier is actually comatose, but the original plan is to hold on and protect it as much as possible. And in so doing, you restrict the availability of capacity into that market. It actually automatically leads to an increase in the price, and the passengers eventually decide that, well, you know what, it's actually not worth our while to even fly because it's too expensive.
Right. So, Sean, interrogate this for us, because a few interesting points coming up here. The whole idea that in other Western countries, or in Western countries, there is the issue of leasing aircraft rather than owning aircraft. And Aaron has alluded to the position of national carriers here. Are national carrier models, though, still viable, or do they need, a fundamental rethink? Is there room for more low-cost carriers, as we see in Europe, in Africa, or does the market structure make it too difficult to sustain?
A government has no place trying to run a business in competition with the private sector. Governments exist to create an enabling environment and not to actually micromanage the minutiae of an industry and obviously try to skew it in certain ways towards their political goals. And, as Aaron said, we see this regularly, and it actually winds up skewing the definition of success for a number of airlines. A number of African airlines today, and especially the national carriers, tend to define success as running half-empty wide-body planes to London, to Paris, and to Dubai, as long as they are painted in the national colors. And people view this as some sort of great success, no matter the fact that it's losing hundreds of millions of dollars, which the taxpayer then has to bail out. So when we start looking at things like this, and we look especially at the fact that in Africa, capital is very hard hard to acquire. While in the Western world or in more developed economies in general, you can obtain capital from the private sector. You can obtain capital on the basis of a merit of an investment. In Africa, sources of capital are either from commercial banks at usurious rates in many cases. We're talking rates in the 20 and 30% sometimes relative to single digits in much of the developed economies, or you are winding up having to go to government or government affiliated bodies, which come with their own strings attached and consequently limit your ability to be able to operate an airline professionally and operate an airline with commercial interests in mind, as opposed to commercial interests which are influenced by political interests as well. So Aaron is absolutely right in that way. We have created a system in Africa, unfortunately, where we have made airlines dependent on government policy, and government policy does not run well inherently when it comes to operating in the private sector as opposed to simply regulating it.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. And we will be exploring that single air transport market when we return from the break. For now, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion on the struggles facing Africa's aviation industry. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Sean Mendes and Aaron Munitsi. Let's continue our discussion on Africa's turbulent aviation industry. Sean, I want to explore a little bit about that single air transport market, because flying within Africa costs on average, we have established, some 45% more than the global average. But since 2018, 38 countries representing over 80% of the African market have committed to that single African air transport market. Has this single market policy delivered meaningful progress?
In one word, no. The unfortunate reality is, while 38 countries have signed up to it on paper, I'd say maybe a dozen or maybe 20 of them have actually implemented it in both the letter and the spirit. The reality is that the SATAM, the Single African Air Transport Market of 2018, is actually repackaging the Yamoussoukro decision, and in fact, before that, the Yamoussoukro Declaration, which all 54 African states signed up to back in the late 1980s. In fact, 70% of Africans alive today have spent their entire life waiting for their leaders to implement something that was decided upon unanimously by every member of the African Union nearly 40 years ago. So the fact that once again something is being repackaged and is not getting 100% sign up for it just simply says that this is it is an attempt to salvage the last chance of making SATAM actually work for the African market, as opposed to something which is going to be the vision of the future. SATAM is a brilliantly written document. In fact, I've compared SATAM to other single skies markets like the European Union single aviation market and so forth. SATAM is actually a much better written document. However, the Yamoussoukro decision started a few years before the European single market began implementation, and yet the European single market has been in place for over 20 years, while we're still talking about pilot programs and implementation of SATAM and how to get people who already committed to this 40 years ago to actually sign up to implement it yet again. The reality is that a number of African leaders are simply jokers on this issue. They're paying it lip service, right, but they're not taking the concrete steps needed to actually reduce these barriers, to actually make it easier for African airlines to serve Africans and provide their own constituents with very critical transport links.
Right. So, Aaron, we've established that, SATAM could actually be a game changer here. But first of all, though, why are there so few intra-Africa flights across the continent?
I think maybe I would differ with Sean on one element here. And that element is, if we are to hold back and just pull back a bit and say, okay, if the sentiment is that SATAM is not working, can we go back and just look at the current operating environment and take away those things that were brought by SATAM, and let's see what remains? So I tend to be very cautious when I hear my colleagues say Satam is not working, it's not working as much as we would want it to work, but it is definitely working. To your question, Beatrice, why are we still finding challenges in terms of the number of routes and availability of flights? It's simply because there is that reticence, the reluctance of our countries, our leaders opening up to other Africans. I can tell you, I've been to each and every one of the 55 countries on the continent. The number of times I've been asked to fill in a form for as an arrival for a visa that I've already obtained. And I am a very amicable person. When I ask the officials at the immigration desk, so what do you do with this piece of paper? 9 times out of 10, they don't even know what that paper is going to do.
Right.
And sometimes when I ask them, when you take my fingerprints, what do you do with these fingerprints? I can tell you, in one situation, the young lady said to me, actually, the machine is not even working. So that's where the challenge is. People are still doing things for the sake of doing things without actually understanding the impact it has on the continent. But most importantly, if you look at the economics of what aviation does to an economy, look at even the USA, look at Europe, the catalytic effect that comes from aviation is so significant. It has been so well documented. But for us on the continent, it seems as if we are blind to the actually positive catalytic effect of enhancing aviation, and we want to hold back because we are still protecting our almost comatose dead national carriers.
Right. So, Sean, let's look at some practical solutions here for Africa's aviation industry. What practical steps, though, do you think African governments can take to improve intra-African connectivity in the next 5 years?
As I said before, I think the role of African governments is not necessarily to take specific steps to try and regulate a market, but rather to create an enabling environment. And I think the number one aspect of that is easier access to capital for African airlines. Today, an African airline is forced often to make poor decisions because of limited access to capital. They cannot access the kind of aircraft that they want because whether it's on a lease, because they can't pay huge amounts in lease deposits that are often demanded. They can't afford to buy brand new aircraft because you can't afford the hundreds of millions of dollars in that respect. And a lot of this is because of policies as well as African economies in general, where you struggle to get foreign exchange in probably half of African countries today. If you wanted to go out, you may have plenty of money in the bank, whether in Malawian kwacha or Mozambican metikash or Ethiopian birr, but to actually get that in hard currency, to acquire an aircraft, to pay for jet fuel in a foreign country and so forth, is a very, very long drawn and difficult process. So consequently, for a government to be able to take steps to allow this capital to be more mobile and to prioritize aviation in that respect is probably the most important thing that governments can do in order to boost aviation on the continent and to make African airlines more competitive, both with other African airlines as well as with the non-African competitors that often come head-to-head with them on many of these key routes.
Right. So, Aaron, before I come to you with some practical solutions here, I do want to look at some tax issues as well that may have assisted intra-Africa travel here. Because as of January 2026, ECOWAS implemented a major policy to scrap various air travel taxes and to cut security passenger charges by about 25% across West Africa. Has this had any impact on competitiveness and the bottom line?
That was a very good intention. But unfortunately, the execution is horrible. So while the ECOWAS is applauded because they have that good intention, they actually signed the agreement to reduce those taxes, fees, and charges. We all appreciate that. However, while they were doing that, before the ink was even dry, some of the countries in ECOWAS introduced additional taxes that actually made the travel even higher, even when they reduced this particular tax. So Nigeria and Ghana, for example, introduced new additional taxes that they call API taxes of about $100 per passenger. Automatically, it means if you were going to travel between Lagos and Accra, you're going to end up paying an additional $200, which was not even there, even though they've reduced the taxes, fees, and charges by another $75. The net effect is that they've actually increased. So the intention is good, and we would like to continue to advocate other countries, other regulators to reduce, if not remove, these taxes, fees, and charges. but do not belabor the point by increasing the cost because of other things. And unfortunately, wherever we go, we notice that aviation is actually seen as a cash cow. Aviation is seen as an activity for the elite. It's not seen as an economic activator that actually activates the economies of these countries. That change of mentality is what we are advocating for, and we are making sure that wherever we go, we make sure the country itself understands the net effect of increasing aviation and making sure that everybody understands the catalytic effect of aviation to their economy.
Right. Sean, I want to get your thoughts here. Do you think tax cuts could accelerate aviation growth on the continent?
In the ECOWAS case, what we have actually seen is not tax elimination, but rather tax substitution. You say, I'm taking away this tax, but I'm just going to put another tax back in under a different name. And taxes tend to be trending up throughout Africa right now. There is a bit of, the challenge here is that when you view aviation as an activity for the elite and tax it accordingly, you create a self-fulfilling prophecy where now only the elite can afford aviation. And consequently, you want to tax it more, and consequently, the prices rise and you shut more and more people out of it. Aviation should be viewed as no different than ground transport, as rail transport, and other mass market transport. The only reason that aviation is accessible only to the elite is because of poor policy making in many cases, which has priced it out of the reach of your average traveler who is going to visit his parents, who is going on a short business trip, and who actually values his time more and his safety more, because aviation is the safest way of traveling across Africa, especially compared to roads in many of these countries. So governments can see huge amounts of benefits from safety perspectives, from medical perspectives, from time perspectives, from productivity, by simply making it easier by reducing these punitive taxes in many cases that are levied upon airlines and travelers.
Right. So, gentlemen, I want to get your concluding remarks here, and thank you all very much for a lively discussion. Over the next 20 years, Africa's market is forecast to grow 4.1% annually, reaching about 500 million passengers. What a single policy decision could transform aviation within the next few years, within the next 5 years, let's say, Aaron, very briefly?
Full implementation of the single Africa air transport market and complete reversal or removal of the visa restrictions. Allow Africans to travel across the African continent and make sure that countries also treat aviation as an enabler of economies. We will be definitely set for progress.
Right. Sean, your thoughts?
I think that regardless of whether African governments and whether African policymakers take any steps, I think African businesses and African airlines in particular have shown themselves to be very versatile and resilient. So I think that African aviation will continue to grow, notwithstanding the actions of governments and other stakeholders, but will grow nonetheless. That said, I think the important thing we need to look at is allowing the private sector to take a larger role in terms of African aviation, whether that's running airlines or whether that is investing in infrastructure. The policymakers should look more in terms of allowing private sector, whether that is African investors, whether that is foreign investors, joint ventures and so forth, but allowing these people to come on in and take Africa into the next century with global standards is the one thing that will really let African aviation realize its true potential over the next few decades.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for that lively discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to my guests, Sean Mendes, aviation consultant, and Aaron Munetsi, CEO, Airlines Association of Southern Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X, and you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep this conversation going, and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.